Right then, let's go.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the 2-on-1 Powerchair Football Podcast, powered as always by MK Battery, supporting players, clubs and competitions across the game. My name is Ryan Sipple, and in today's episode we're taking a deep dive into one of the most significant events our sport has seen, the inaugural FIPFA Powerchair Football Club World Cup, hosted this summer in Paris at the stunning PRISME Arena. Joining me to relive it all is Charlie McLellan, who, like me, was on commentary throughout the week. Together we called every second of every match, from the opening kickoff to the final whistle, and now we're here today to unpack all of that. We're not going to go through the competition match by match. Instead, we'll almost zoom out, explore each team's journey, what the tournament delivered, and what it revealed about the global game. We'll also cover things such as the venue, the structure of the competition, the broadcast setup, refereeing, and others. So really excited to get into it. I want to say a huge thank you to FIPFA and host Upsilon Charlie McLellan for giving us the opportunity to commentate and really help connect it and share it with that global audience. Charlie, how are you?
I am very good, thank you. I'm enjoying the off-season. I think now Powerchair football things are starting to kick in again. Pre-season friendlies are going on and the rumblings of the new season are here. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a very good year for the sport.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind couple of weeks for us personally following that Club World Cup. Of course, we frantically returned to England for the FA Disability Cup finals between West Brom and Aspire. A few weeks after that, we had the pleasure of commentating England versus USA at St George's Park, which in itself was historic. And then we also got to debut in the mainstream men's game, calling the action of Lincoln City versus West Brom. So who would have thought these drab, monotone voices of ours would be received so well across the board?
Yeah, it's been a great couple of weeks, and the sort of opportunities that we've been given founded in Powerchair football have been unbelievable. Yeah, it's honestly, it's been such a exciting time. Me and you have been jet setting. It's been great.
Absolutely. So we're here to talk about the Club World Cup, so I think it's only right I set the scene properly before we get into everything. The 2025 FIPFA Powerchair Football Club World Cup ran from the 23rd to the 27th of June, all based at the PRISME Arena in Bobigny, just outside Paris. It's a brand new venue built specifically for parasport, and it was its first major event. I think they only opened the doors to the public in February. And we had 8 teams from 4 continents split across 2 groups, with the top 2 from each going through to the semis and everyone else playing for final placements. It was simple, it was clear, and it gave every team a full week of matches to actually show what they're about on that international stage, because it was so unique. We've never seen that cross-continental competition when it comes to club level. So in Group A, we had Upsilon Charlie McLellan, West Bromwich Albion, Club National de Football, and Western Sydney Wanderers. And Group B had Grafto Vilnius Dask, Aspire, Raidos and Tigres de Pacheco. So a serious lineup of squads that all earned their position there. When we break down club by club, I'll talk about their qualification to this competition and how they earned their spots there. Looking at that setup, Charlie, the spread of teams, the structure across the week, how did you feel it worked? And did it feel balanced? Did it flow right? And did the teams get enough of a platform to actually show what they could do?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the format. I thought it was really well put together. Considering we only had one court, at events like this we usually have 2 courts that run at the same time. but the fact that we only really had one is, I guess, what separated them from doing the sort of entire league table and splitting into two groups. But it worked really well. The groups were both competitive, I think. Obviously, it was a difficult one because there was always going to be that sort of unfortunate side of the draw. Whichever group got the Argentinian team, because obviously they split the South Americans, they split the French teams, they split the English teams. Whichever one sort of got that third edition of the Argentinian team was always going to have a really tough group, because there were sort of three top teams battling for two spots, and that ended up being Group B. But I thought, the groups were really well balanced. They sprung up some great games, and also they didn't, they left some stuff to the imagination. There were top teams that didn't face until the final, as opposed to, in the FIPFA Cup last year, when everyone had played everybody by the last week, which meant that even, on the last day, we were still excited because we were watching teams that hadn't played each other yet face off for the first time.
Yeah, I think there was a few questions around the qualification process and how the final 8 were selected. But like you, I think for a first edition, I think it worked really well in terms of the format, the one court venue. I want to unpack that in a little bit more detail. Those two things specifically, being the format and the one court aspect. But on this iteration, I think it was brilliant. I think it's a real shame we didn't get to see a USA representative, especially with the quality they've got. But that was purely down to timing. The tournament clashed with their own national club championships, so it just wouldn't have been feasible to send a team. But you can absolutely imagine the likes of a Minnesota Shockwave or a Turnstone Flyers coming over and really challenging those top European sides, and the South Americans for that matter. What was so unique here is we're used to seeing those cultural and tactical interpretations play out at an international stage, but this was the first time we've ever seen that at club level. So seeing the different coaching styles, the different game plans, the identities, all mixing together in one venue across 5 days, it was fascinating to watch unfold. I think it's a real big, important piece of work now for FIPFA to formalise the qualification process for 2029, because I believe that's when the next iteration will be, and make it crystal clear what that ticketing year looks like, whether it's 27 or 28. If they define that, I think we'll see clubs really ramp up their efforts to try and secure their place. For consistency across the board, and you may disagree, Charlie, I would personally want qualification to centre on domestic champions, maybe from the 27-28 leagues across the world. But then we have a question about how many teams are present, because then that restricts it to only 8 countries. The reason I say that is because the 2 French teams, the 2 English teams, all earned their ticket to this competition through the FIPFA Champions Cup, which is good, which is fine. But when the Asia-Oceania zone and the South America zone don't have equivalents, it's hard to have that consistency across the board.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there does have to be some sort of formal process to qualify. I like the domestic champions thing. If you focus it back to England, you think, Teesside not being there after the season that they had this season was really unfortunate. They were the best team in the country this year, on a consistent basis. They probably deserve to be there. It's tough because I can understand why you'd use a tournament like the FIPFA Champions Cup, and I think, winning the FIPFA Champions Cup, if there's another FIPFA Champions Cup in 2027, I would back the winners of that getting a place, regardless of what they do in the league for the next 2 years, the winners of that getting a place in the Club World Cup. But yeah, it did feel like a bit informal. And I think, the absence of the American team, and also, the fact that we didn't see a Japanese team, for example, was disappointing. I would have liked to see it wider reaching, and I would have liked to see it organised enough in advance where there wasn't the sort of schedule clash with the American nationals. And obviously, it was even difficult for the English teams because of the FA Disability Cup. I would have loved to see those things sort of considered right at the start of the scheduling process. I understand that the tournament didn't come about with years and years of planning. It was a relatively very well planned but a relatively spontaneous thing. I would like to see a bit more sort of forethought put into the rules of who qualifies, and also making sure that every country and every region is fairly represented there, because that is at the end of the day what it is. Well, of course it is a competition. It's also a showcase, and also a place for sort of shared learning where different countries can show other countries what they've got effectively.
Yeah, I think opinions will definitely vary. Just on one of the points you raised, I think given the timescales that they had to work with to organise this Club World Cup, I think it was brilliant. I think they will take a lot of positives from that inaugural competition. And when we're talking about potential innovations and alterations to the format, that's only because we have a solid foundation to use as that comparison point. Assuming it stays as 8 clubs, which I don't think it should be set in stone, I would love to see 1 club per nation. I would like 8 teams, 8 countries, because that level of diversity would be incredible. But at the same time, I can also really see the value from having 2 from a really strong country, especially if they've earned it through domestic or continental competitions. We had 8 clubs, 2 groups of 4, with the top 2 progressing. Did that feel like in terms of eight teams, did that feel like the right number to you in terms of variety and opportunity? And looking ahead to 2029, if FIPFA were to expand it, what would you see as the ideal number of teams?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think I would probably say I would like it to go to 10, and I would like the knockout stages to be a bit longer. I think while the group stages are cool, I really enjoy knockout football, and so if it went to 10, the format I would use was 10. The top 4 teams from each group qualify, so that means that only 1 team doesn't qualify from the groups, and then you have quarterfinals as well as semi-finals and a final. I'd quite like an extended knockout stage. Top of Group A play 4th of Group B, and then continued down. I think that would not only give the most teams a chance to qualify for knockout football and the most chance of stuff like cool upsets and big drama, which is what we want from the sport, as well as sort of consistent competition. But I think 10 teams would be fair, because when you look at the teams we had there, it really felt like we were only missing 2 teams maybe. I would have liked to have seen an American team, and I would have liked to see potentially an Asian team. But other than that, it felt like we had a pretty solid number. I just thought it's an interesting one, doing 1 team from each nation, but also if you are doing that, then this is the pinnacle of the sport. And we would have had, for example, in France, it would have been Momo Galami or Brian Weiss who would have been there. That both of those players could not have played in that competition. And considering, which I'm sure we'll touch on later, the broadcasting of the competition, that would have been really unfortunate. The same with England. It would have been, Ed Common, Chris Gordon, or John Balding. It would not have been all of those players at once. And that is one thing that... And also, I think we don't want to force players to choose between wanting to play for their club and wanting to play in these big tournaments. If it goes to 1 club per nation, there's a risk of players making moves to clubs to, solidify their spot in that competition, and clubs becoming... And there's a chance, and I'm not saying it would, but that affecting the domestic league as well. So I like the fact that some nations have 2 clubs. I think there are, while obviously all nations are developing, there are some leagues that are objectively stronger than others across the world. The French league and the English league being 2 of the strongest. And I think having double qualification spots for those, as you saw in the running game Club World Cup, where Chelsea and Man City were there from England. That would be something that I would like to see continue, because I think having the best players in the world at these events is very important.
No, it's a fantastic point you raise, and this is why I kind of wanted this conversation to talk about these elements. The reason why I said I'd like to see it restricted to one club per nation, it's not even a set in stone statement on my behalf. I just want to keep it simple in terms of that qualification process, that ticketing process, because as mentioned, the French and the English teams all earned their position there through one competition. The South American clubs qualified through the South American equivalent of the Champions League, the Copa Libertadores. But there is no equivalent in America or Australia. So we saw Western Sydney Wanderers as 2024 AFA Club champions win through domestic success. The same with Mexico. So we had some intercontinental, some continental champions, but then we had some domestic champions. And that consistency is something that I think can be worked on, or there can be regulations or guidelines that help provide that clarity. But you are absolutely right to highlight the FIFA Club World Cup that's just taken place in America. And I know there was a lot of controversy and questions around the ticketing process for that. When you've got a Chelsea who ultimately went on to win it, I think they earned their spot. Was it the Champions League that they won against Manchester City?
Yeah, years ago.
Years ago, exactly. I understand it for Powerchair Football more so needing to give maybe a 2-year buffer, because things such as fundraising and logistics are a huge headache when it comes to our sport. So if I'm FIPFA, I'm just saying clearly the winners of these competitions in 27 or the competition winners of these in 28 will have the option to put their name in the hat for the next Club World Cup. But it's really interesting. Something that we have touched on that I want to unpack a little bit more is the single court setup. So it's almost a spectacle versus scale dilemma. I think it had a big impact on the feel of the entire tournament, and it's not unusual by any means to have a single court venue, but we do see when they ramp up in their quantity, 2 courts utilised. Am I right in saying that the Champions Cup last year was a 2-court venue?
Yeah, it was, until it was similar to the World Cup in terms of it was 2 court until the knockouts, and then it went to a single court thing. But yeah, it was. I do like a 2 court venue, I have to admit. I think as someone who is just really, I love watching the sport and I love watching different games. It's always nice to have an option of sort of what's going on over there. Oh, this game's a bit slow. What's going on that court? And I get why it was a showpiece. I don't think the venue was conducive to having 2 courts. I mean, there was a second court, obviously, at PRISME, but it wasn't anything that, should have been hosting a Club World Cup match. It was very small. It was a sports hall, like, for example, the teams would train in here in England. I get why it was single court. I really do. But also, I think if you're expanding the tournament, trying to find a venue that can accommodate 2 courts would be the move. Cité de Sport, which was where the Champions Cup was fantastic for that. And I just think, as well, being able to get through those group stage games quicker gives you a chance to have a more extended knockout phase. And if you want to add more teams, obviously, then it's going to be very difficult to sort of keep that single court thing going.
Yeah, I mean, expanding it to a 2-court venue, I would almost disagree with you. I think the single court venue was amazing, and I kind of unpacked why. But firstly, expanding it to a 2-court venue comes with several challenges. You need to double the officials. You need to double the volunteers. You need that scheduling flexibility, the broadcast, which we are going to talk about in detail. You need to almost double that. And the level that we had in Paris was so unprecedented for what we've had before. It's that logistical and financial juggling act. Obviously, at the Club World Cup, I think the single court setup worked really well in terms of the consistency and production because we had that 8-team format. The upcoming FIPFA Nations Cup, however, will be a fascinating test because I believe that is a one-court venue that features 10 teams. So that is going to be a really intense fixture turnaround. That was nice with Paris. We had good gaps in between the games to rest, recuperate, and prepare for the next game. So I think Italy will serve as that example to see if it's viable moving forward, because we've experienced both. We've had that single court venue competition in Paris, but we was part of the World Cup in Australia. I just wouldn't want to see the world-class streaming and commentary be diminished because we have to almost divide our assets in two.
Yeah, I do get that, and I think there was a lot of good things that came from the fact that we were, on every game together. In terms of the commentary, we commentated every single game, just the two of us, and we watched literally every single second of football that was available to be watched that week. And we also managed to catch pretty much all of the friendlies as well. So I have to say that was very good in terms of giving us a broad knowledge of what was going on, helping us grow into the tournament. And also, the good thing about a single court venue is every team gets their fair amount of the spotlight in terms of everybody plays in front of that big crowd. No game is... Because I think the issue with having a double court venue, and it was the same at the FIPFA Champions Cup, is there's usually one court that's better than the other. It's very rare that you can get two identical courts. And then it gets to a point where it's like, does that mean their game means more than ours because we're on court 2 and they're on court 1? And I think the fact that it was all on the same court and all with the same level of, passion from us as commentators and the same level of streaming showed that it was, every game was valued equally, whether that was, the final or the 7th, 8th place playoff. It was all valued at the same level, and that was really nice to see. And I think also we were very lucky that we had long gaps, because I think there was one morning, wasn't there, where I think it was a Uruguayan team had some difficulties trying to get to the venue, and kickoff was delayed by, I think, 25 minutes to half an hour. Now, if there was a tighter turnaround, that could have caused a massive issue in terms of the scheduling of the tournament. So when you mention Italy, that is the thing you do have with the single court thing, is if there is a technical issue or someone's late or something happens, which can happen in any sport, there is a risk, of course, that scheduling becomes difficult, but it was managed fantastically in Paris, and it did definitely add to the spectacle. It made it fantastic to watch. Yeah, it was. I really enjoyed the single court venue, and as much as I probably am a bit of a traditionalist and I do prefer a double court venue just because I feel like that's when there's two games going on at once and there's everything happening, I think that's the sport at its best. But I do think it was a fantastic showcase to have the single court venue, and I also agree that what we did on that one court in terms of the streaming and the commentary and the officiating couldn't have been replicated onto two courts.
Yeah, I agree. And I absolutely loved Sydney for the World Cup. And if you can ensure that doubling the production and splitting the audience and factoring in the additional costs isn't of the detriment of the football or the competition, then I think it's a really viable option to go with a two-court venue. But I think you're right to highlight the teams all getting their individual share of the spotlight. The atmosphere was fairly consistent because there was only one court for all of the spectators, all of the teams on the periphery of an ongoing game that could go in and watch. I think it's a perfect place to progress now is to the PRISME, the stage itself, which played a massive role in how this tournament was experienced, both in person and across the streams. Purpose-built Paralympic venue on the outskirts of Paris. And for this first ever Club World Cup, it felt like the perfect fit. It was designed to host elite level disability sport, and you could tell that from the moment we arrived. You could sense this was something different. The scale, the setup, the branding, the accessibility, everything was almost tailored to elevate the competition and deliver a proper world-class event. What were your initial impressions on arriving at the PRISME for day one, and as the week went on, how do you reflect on its role almost hosting it?
Yeah, I loved the PRISME. I thought it was a fantastic venue, obviously purpose-built, so completely accessible, allowed players to watch games courtside, allowed players to go right up to the top of the seating and watch games, and obviously changing rooms for every team, a secondary court for them to warm up on and for speed tests to take place in. It was a great venue. It was absolutely perfect. It also afforded the opportunity, which is something that if you weren't at the venue you wouldn't have seen, for the teams to all go and eat together. The food, oh my god, the food was unbelievable in the week. Shout out to whoever did the catering, because we were getting lunch and dinner at the venue every day, and it was absolutely top quality. And all the teams could sort of sit in sort of two phases, could sit and eat and socialise, not only with their teammates, but also go and socialise with other teams as well and officials. Yeah, I really enjoyed the venue. I thought it was perfect to host a tournament like that. I think the only sort of disappointing thing was that obviously accommodation in that area, there was not, like there was in Sydney, that sort of one village where all the players were hosted. They were sort of spread out across the city of Paris and had 15 to sort of 25-minute commutes every morning to get to the ground, to the arena. But no, I thought it was fantastic. I thought PRISME was such a well-chosen venue, and it was a massive privilege to be there. And in terms of as well the facilities for us as commentators and for the broadcast team and for the officials, everyone was very well looked after and had exactly what they needed to do their job to the best of the abilities.
Yeah, I completely agree. How brilliant the PRISME Arena was. From the moment that we arrived, you could tell it was just built for elite disability sport. Everything about it felt intentional. Kind of the size of the courts, the level flooring, the space around the perimeter, and just how accessible the whole venue was. You didn't have to. I think it was a 3 or 4 level venue, and you didn't have to use stairs or a lift to access it. There was a kind of a spiral ramp that went the whole way around the building, and I think players really appreciated that. You've touched on it. Logistically, it wasn't the easiest place to get to, especially with the teams and the staff spread out across multiple hotels in different parts of Paris. I think my daily commute was 30-40 minutes, which was a real challenge. Once you arrived, however, the standard of the venue made it completely worth it, but it just feels right to note that. And having experienced the World Cup together, we saw firsthand how valuable it is to have those shared spaces. And I know we had dinner together, we socialised together in the evenings, but a lot of people were almost thinking, I need to get home, I've got a big day tomorrow, let's get back to the hotel. That wasn't the case in Sydney, because the shared spaces and the socialising areas were in the hotels. And that creates a real sense of community and international exchange that I think epitomises these international competitions. I know that's far easier said than done, especially when you're talking about securing accessible hotel rooms for 60, 80 players across different teams. But it's something I'd love to see prioritised for future tournaments, because those informal moments away from the games themselves, the meals together, the breakout areas where there's table tennis tables, there's gaming consoles, those are the memories that last just as long as the results. But overall, PRISME was amazing. I want to give massive credit to Abdi, the president of Upsilon, who was absolutely outstanding throughout. One of the most impressive people I've ever met. Calm, he is committed, incredibly hard-working, and you can tell how passionate he is and how deeply he cares about Powerchair football. Everything from the presentation to the way the teams were looked after had his stamp on it, and he never made it about himself, but he helped deliver something that set the tone for what a Club World Cup should and look like. So yeah, I just want to give a huge credit to him. What do you think were the main successes of the tournament, both whether from an on-court perspective or an off-court perspective?
I think the off-court stuff was probably, well, obviously the football was of a very good quality, and I'm sure we'll touch on a lot of the on-court stuff next. That was the main event. I think this was really a tournament where the off-court stuff sort of came to the forefront. I think the broadcast was incredible. Obviously, it was live on beIN Sport, which is, you know, a mainstream French channel. Every single game was covered on that. You know, we had sort of that dual commentary setup up at the top where me and you were doing the English commentary for the YouTube stream, and then there was the French commentary next to us for the television. It was just so nice for us having, you know, a screen in front of us where we could access live replays of what was going on at any time, where we could, you know, watch the game on that screen if we wanted to get more detail. And the production team, that we had a significant production team that were working in sort of a little office space down beneath us to make sure that the broadcast was high quality. And I think that was probably the biggest strength of the tournament was the quality of the broadcast and the social media coverage. And yeah, the off-field stuff was just massive. And in terms of what you want from a tournament, even just things such as having, you know, the LED advertising boards around the court, which just made it look so professional, and obviously gave increased opportunity for sponsorship revenue as well. The big screen within the venue, which showed the game live as it was going on for the spectators. If you were someone new who'd never watched the sport before and you showed up at PRISME just to have a look, you would think that it was, you know, so just elite, and that's what it is. But this tournament really was the most polished and elite version of Powerchair football in terms of the off the court and the aesthetic of it that I've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, having supported the broadcast efforts for multiple domestic and international competitions, including that World Cup, we had a good benchmark for what professional broadcasting can look like in Powerchair football. But with that Sydney World Cup, it wasn't really until the last 3 or 4 games, being the semi-final and the final, that we got that multi-camera setup with proper replays and angles and structure. Before that, relatively speaking, it was fairly basic. It was single camera, minimal presentation, and no replays for most of the group stage. But with Paris, every single game had multi-camera coverage, live replays, proper presentation across both FIPFA's international live stream, which we had the pleasure of kind of organising, and beIN Sports France, who broadcast the tournament domestically, match by match, across their platforms, which was a huge moment. Having a major broadcaster commit to a full Powerchair football tournament, not just the final or the highlights, but the whole thing. You've touched on the commentary zone, the headsets, the monitor, the live stream feeds, the production staff, everything you'd expect from a mainstream sporting event. It just added a layer of credibility and presence that lifted the whole experience. They have well and truly set the standard for Powerchair football, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, massively. That has to be the benchmark for all major tournaments from now. I mean, I know from looking at even what we've done with a couple of WFA events since then, that hopefully every national FA is doing what we're trying to do and replicate that and try and get the domestic stuff to that standard as well. But the major international events have to look like the FIPFA Club World Cup did, because it was just unbelievable in terms of the technical quality of it was second to none. It was just world class. It was like, there was no difference in the quality of broadcast for the Club World Cup of Powerchair football and the Club World Cup of the running game. Like, they were both just fantastically done, top of the class. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, the fact that we were going back to our hotels in the evening, turning on the TV, and it was there, full match coverage from the day on BN Sports, which is just genuinely unprecedented. It's unheard of, and not just the final or a highlight reel. We're talking full length, multi-camera, group stage matches with commentary, replays, interviews. And to put that into context, in England, we've obviously got the TNT Sports televised final, which is a massive moment in our calendar. It's one of, if not the ultimate goal for so many of our players to reach. It's part of that wider FA Disability Cup weekend, which celebrates 6 different impairment formats, and Powerchair Football is just one of those. And it's still brilliant, and it's still the highlight. But this was something completely different. This was Powerchair Football as the sole focus. Every single game had the same broadcast attention, and it set the standard. And we know that the money, the logistics, and the considerations that have to be factored in if you're going to get something akin to that. But I just hope that serves as such a powerful example that with that investment, you can put so many new eyes on the sport of Powerchair football, and you'll see a return on that investment, maybe not in a financial sense, but in terms of getting our sport out there and introducing new individuals with a disability to this world, to this incredible sport. So really exciting that precedent has been set, and now we look forward to the 3 World Cup qualifying events, firstly in Italy for the Euros, then in the APO Cup in Brisbane, and then the America's Cup in Arizona, all coming up in the next 3 months. So we've kind of spoken about the overview of the competition. I want to now look at the 8 clubs that made history at this first ever iteration. We don't necessarily break down match by match or getting too bogged down in results, but I do want to reflect on each team's overall journey, how they performed relative to expectation and what impressed us most. So, Charlie, we'll go through each one, and I just want a few things from you, almost quick fire. Your general feelings and thoughts, maybe a moment that stood out, and a player that caught your eye. So I think it's only right we start with the champions, Upsilon Shatney Malabry, home soil, redemption on the line after that disappointment of the FIPFA Champions Cup loss. For me, from the first whistle, they were the team to beat. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, they started the competition, didn't they, without their captain, Momo Galami. He was suspended for the first 2 games, and they still won those 2 games, including a game against West Bromwich Albion. So they showed their strength of the squad. It felt like we arrived and the headline and the narrative was already written, and it was going to be an Upsilon home win. All the work that had gone on to it from people at Upsilon, you mentioned Abdi earlier, but the wider Upsilon community as well. They did deserve to win. They were fantastic. Momo Galami, while he was missed for the first 2 games, came back in and just started to dominate. Their semi-final against Tigres de Pacheco was one of the best Powerchair football games I've ever watched, especially the opening sort of 10 minutes. They were just absolutely crazy. It was a fantastic showing from Upsilon. They came in, they were just unfazed by anything. They were patient, and they were so mature. You think about their performance in the final. They just waited, and they were just happy to wait for Villeneuve to make the mistake. Eventually they did, and then they punished them. They were scoring goals late on in games as well, which showed the character they had. They were dominant from start to finish and very deserved champions.
Yeah, I completely agree. Momo naturally grabs the headlines, and rightfully so. He is world class, and his ability can change a game in a second. But I was actually more impressed by the depth of their entire squad. During his absence, others stepped up, and when he returned, they didn't just play through him, they supported and complemented him. So, if I'm going to ask you for a player that you would say, it doesn't have to be necessarily one that's in the headlines, but one that you was really impressed with, who would you select?
I think, to be fair, Tristan Delmas he does so much dirty work. Like, he's a proper workhorse of a player. He's so composed. He was sort of taking the role of Momo when he wasn't in the team. He was great on the wing, great in the middle. He was, probably my standout player for Epsilon. I don't think, even though he did end up writing all the headlines, Momo, with his goal in the final, I don't think you can take that away from Tristan being the most consistent player throughout the tournament for Epsilon. Yeah, he was fantastic.
No, likewise, I've selected a player and a moment for each of the 8 squads, and for Epsilon, I have also selected Tristan Delmas. First time properly watching him, I thought he was sensational. He's such a good player, and one that I'm really excited to watch more of going forward. Honourable mention to Noel Zeren, who strikes a dead ball like no other player I've ever seen. Absolutely clinical, several assists, and can change a game in a second also. So, no, Tristan Delmas, of course, needs recognition. And then if we're talking about moments, it's hard to look past that winning goal in the dying embers of the final.
Yeah, it is very difficult. I think that was such a great finish. I think, if it's not a goal you've watched back, I'm sure you've watched it back many times, Ryan, after your commentator's curse moment when you said that Slim Bouchetta has not messed up a goal kick the entire tournament, as he plays it into the path of Momo, who just spun it, absolutely smacked it into the goal. The scenes celebrating with their supporters late on in the final, it was a fantastic moment, and one that was deserved for Epsilon. They were gutted last year after the Champions Cup that they didn't win it on home soil. They were really, really gutted, and you can understand why. But yeah, they got their fairy tale this year, which was really nice to see. And yeah, that moment in the final was just, it felt like that final was building to something. And then, Villeneuve hit the post, and you were like, oh, are they going to go and nick it on the counter-attack? Have Epsilon not learnt their lessons from last year? And then it sort of died out, and you were thinking, oh, this is going to go to extra time and penalties. And then all of a sudden, just that moment, that lapse in concentration and that moment of brilliance from Galami, and they were champions.
Yeah, and a huge congratulations to them for that. Let's progress on to Grafter Villeneuve d'Ascq, the runners-up. I thought they were sensational across the week. They played with flair, they moved the ball beautifully, but were also pragmatic when they needed. That draw against Aspire in the group stage, I think they were very lucky away to come away with something, which we can probably delve into when we highlight Aspire. I will say, if Florian Lechantre had not been reclassified prior to the penultimate day, I genuinely believe they would have had that edge in the final. You've spoken about Slim Bouchetta. For me, just a sensational player. I want to issue a public apology to him for that commentator's curse. But across the competition as a whole, he was calm, he was clear, he was commanding. And the 1-2 pivot he's established with Brian Weiss is one of the best I've seen from any team anywhere worldwide. Give me your thoughts on Villeneuve.
Yeah, I really enjoyed watching Villeneuve. They were one of my favourite teams to watch of the week. I thought that they were really unlucky in the final in terms of the chances that they created were probably the best of the two teams, to be honest. I can't remember Epsilon really challenging them and creating a big chance, whereas I think there were a couple of opportunities where Villeneuve did that. I thought Brian Weiss started off the week a bit quiet, but grew into it when the business end of the competition came around. Florian Lechaintre's reclassification, as you mentioned, was a horrific moment. I think probably the moment of the tournament for Villeneuve, for me, there was their semi-final, where they just absolutely thrashed West Brom. It was, a really just dominant performance from start to finish. They were so composed. And then when they had a bit of a wobble in the game and West Brom started to get it moving and they clawed a goal back, they then just went out and scored 2 more just for the fun of it, I think. They were so good in that game, and they were really good in the final as well. And it really felt like if anyone was going to upset the odds, it would have been Villeneuve. But yeah, I think they were really unlucky with the obviously the Lechantre reclassification. He was on fantastic form and was linking up with Youssef Ayad perfectly on the wings. They were a fantastic partnership, and obviously he ended up being the one that dropped out because of, as you mentioned, how good Slim Buscetta is, and Brian Weiss is just undroppable. But it was really unlucky. I felt for Villeneuve a lot, and I felt for them after the final because they'd executed a really good game plan, and they'd probably, in terms of the tactical battle, they'd probably bested Upsilon. They were the team that really tried to get the ball moving, whereas I think Upsilon were more happy to lock it up in the dribble and to not allow for as much passing football. Villeneuve's chances came as a result of sort of free-flowing passing moves. I really enjoyed Villeneuve. I think it's really tough to pick a player of the tournament for them, actually, because I think there were 4 players that were fantastic. In terms of Slim Buscetta, I think he probably, unfortunately for him, because of what happened in the final, he'll be sort of misremembered for that tournament, because up until that point, literally as you mentioned, up until that point, he'd been fantastic. Brian Weiss, naturally, as sort of the central player, will get a lot of the attention, but Youssef Ayad on the wing was unbelievable as well. Florian Lechantre, I feel like I'm going to get splinters here because I'm sat on the fence, but I really cannot pinpoint one of those players because they worked as such a good cohesive unit. They scored so many goals that were very strong team goals. So yeah, the moment of the tournament for me was that semi-final performance against West Brom. But the player of the tournament was, Brian Weiss is the engine, isn't he? But to be honest, any of their starting 4 could have got it.
Yeah, I've got their squad up here. So you've got Slim Buscetta, Brian Weiss, Youssef Ayad, Florent Lechantre, Julien Renier, and Valentin Lefebvre. If you're assessing the quality of a squad through every player, I think every one of them contributed across the competition, which I don't think can be said across any other team in terms of everyone playing their part in progressing them through to the final. We need to remember that in that final, Youssef Ayad had that opportunity on the break, fired it into the left-hand post. If you haven't watched it, I encourage you to do so. My squeaky commentary, thinking that Graaf de Villeneuve-Dasc had wrapped it up, and we're having a very different conversation had that gone in. I will say that my player was Slim Buscetta. I completely accept and disregard the mistake that he made in the final. Any and everyone is prone to errors, and any and everyone across the competition would have made errors. It just happened that he was under the greatest spotlight at the worst possible time. But if you take that out of consideration, I think he was sensational. Probably not just the player for Graaf de Villeneuve-Dasc, but the player of the tournament. I thought he was incredible, and it's a player that I cannot wait to watch more of. If we're going for moments, you're absolutely right to highlight that semi-final win over West Bromwich Albion. But my favourite moment came in their group stage game against Tigres de Pacheco, twofold. It was an incredible assist across the box from Valentin Lefebvre, who didn't have as many minutes as the others in his squad, putting it on a plate for Florian Lechantre to score his hat-trick. And the celebrations for me, which aren't entirely captured on the YouTube stream. I think you had to be there in person to really absorb it and take it in. But all bar Florian went over to Valentin Lefebvre and celebrated with him, because the assist was more impressive than the goal. And then once they'd given Valentin the recognition that he deserved, they all rushed over to Florian to ensure that he was put under the spotlight. So for me, that was the standout moment. I think they were the better team in the final. They should have won, they could have won, but it comes down to moments. And unfortunately, that moment fell to Mohamed Galame, who we know is one of the best players that's ever graced a Powerchair football court. But for me, so many positives, and a lot of them players that are currently preparing for the FIPFA Nations Cup. So you're looking at Brian Weiss and Julien Renier for France, but Florian Lechantre for Belgium as well will play a really big part, as they have strong aspirations for that. So congratulations to Villeneuve. Obviously, it's a commiserations as well, but take a lot of positives because there is a lot of them. Tigres de Pacheco, Charlie. For me, my favourite team of the competition. Fire, passion, skill. They epitomise South American football. Formidable at set plays. Give me your assessments, followed by player and moment.
Yeah, they were so fun, Tigres de Pacheco. They were so much fun to watch. Some of the stuff they did was so unique. The weird sort of kick-off routine that we pinpointed at the start of the week, and then it just got funkier from there. It was fantastic. It was great to watch. It was exactly what you want to see at an international tournament. I think they were really sort of hampered by the level and the sort of the threshold of contact that ended up being allowed. I'm sure officiating is something that we probably will touch on at some point, but I think that was something that was really difficult for them, a team that are very physical and a team that, you know, in previous tournaments and domestically would get away with a lot more than they did at the Club World Cup. I think that was the case for most teams, though, to be honest. But yeah, they were fantastic. The flair. I think my moment of the tournament for them has to be their goal against Aspire when they were late on, and it was just the celebrations. It was Valentino Zegarelli with that finish, just kissing the post and then going over to their supporters and thrashing his chest and then turning around and thrashing Eber Lopez. That was just a fantastic moment. Valentino is just such an obvious poster boy for the sport, isn't he? He's fantastic. And he was another one that I was so disappointed because he ended up having to sort of hush down his involvement in games because he was scared of getting suspensions. Yeah. He probably had learnt that lesson from the World Cup where he was suspended for Argentina's semi-final. He ended up having to sort of quiet down his game. I think their player of the tournament for me was Eber Lopez. He had to step up in place of Valentino Zegarelli because obviously Zegarelli had to take a back seat, and he was very dominant, fantastic in the dribble, a great passer of the ball as well. He was probably their player of the tournament. Caleb Manzour was also very good. They were a great watch, Tigres de Pacheco, really good. And I think if they hadn't been as naive as they were in that semi-final against Upsilon, which I think is the general feeling, they feel that they were a bit naive and a bit giving too much away to Upsilon, I think they would have had a really good chance.
You've summarised it absolutely perfectly, and I'm not going to repeat you because my moment was Valentino Zegarelli's celebrations versus Aspire. Everything that it represented in such a fiery affair, and Eber Lopez was my player. Any and everyone who knows me will know that I am a huge Valentino Zegarelli fan. I've got a signed and framed shirt from the World Cup that is proudly adorned in my office, and I relish the opportunity to watch him and commentate on him and the wider Tigres team, or the Argentinians, because the passion they have is fantastic. Certainly something that I'm not recommended, but something that would have been so interesting is if you had a camera on us during the competition, because our excitement and our animations through goals and celebrations and moments where we was just awestruck by certain things across the week. Ultimately, we're big kids and big fans of the sport. And even in that moment, as two Englishmen commentating against Aspire Tigres, seeing that Valentino goal, we was just amazed by it. And I'm so happy that the photographer Jonathan managed to capture that celebration from Valentino, because it's something that just perfectly epitomises who he is and who his team are. So, no, completely agree. I think Caleb Manzour on those set plays, acting as that screen, that dummy almost. We saw so many world-class finishes from them from that. And they had a fairly thin squad, relatively speaking. I know Juan Bautista D'Angelo played a big part, scored some big goals. Matias Vignola had limited minutes. But one thing that just stands up above all the rest is the fact that Argentina are going to be the dark horses for next year's World Cup.
Yeah, they were at the last one, I think, a bit unexpectedly. I think the thing is, it is going to be different for them this year, because I think everyone is going to be thinking that Argentina is a very tough game. It's going to make for a fascinating spectacle, obviously on home soil as well. The support they have, you'd expect, will be absolutely massive and very vocal. It has all the potential to be a very, very special World Cup for Argentina. They're working really hard, having a lot of camps. They're really ramping up. Yeah, they are going to be a potentially massive threat at that World Cup to sort of the established three top teams, England, France and USA. The Argentinians are sort of coming to that table, coming to the party, and yeah, they could be absolutely unbelievable at that World Cup, because the passion and also the technical quality and the desire that they show is second to none.
I completely agree. Let's go to West Bromwich Albion now in fourth place. By the high standards, especially for those that have watched them regularly, I'd say they didn't hit the levels we would come to expect. This is a team in transition, adjusted to some big player departures. In the end, fourth place, I would say, was a good return. What would give me your thoughts, Charlie?
Yeah, I think they were always going to probably qualify from their group, because they had Western Sydney Wanderers and Club Nacional, and while those are both good teams, they are not at the level of West Bromwich Albion yet. They were a difficult watch at times, West Brom, because you could see what they were trying to do. They just couldn't really get it going. You know, I thought their group stage game against Upsilon was really disappointing. They had a chance to play against Upsilon with no Momo Galami, and they lost 1-0, and they didn't really put up much of a fight against them. And then their semi-final, where they were absolutely thrashed by Villeneuve. But then there were just these moments, and that was, I think, the most frustrating thing, is, for example, in their third place playoff, the second half of that game, they were so good. The football they played was some of the highest quality of any at the tournament. They were amazing. And then they came back, and then, you know, the cup final, which was domestic, I know not part of the Club World Cup, but they came back and they came, you know, whimpering out of the blocks there and were 2-0 down within 10 minutes. And it's like, the inconsistency was, I think, the really frustrating thing. I can understand that they're a team in transition, and they've got a lot of younger players and players that won't have played on that big stage before, but they've also still got more than enough talent in that squad to be putting up a fight against anyone. They did have some good group stage performances, you know, a gritty win against Club Nacional, and then they comfortably beat Western Sydney Wanderers. But yeah, they were not. They did not have the tournament I don't think they would have wanted. In terms of a moment of the tournament for them, I mean, I know it was a tough game for them, but Ollie Rock's goal in that semi-final was unreal. Like, a fantastic finish, one for the highlights reel, I'm sure. I don't think he really could celebrate it the way he would have wanted to, because of obviously the circumstances of being 3-0 down at the time. But it was a fantastic goal. And a player of the tournament, well, Chris Gordon was given the MVP, most valuable player, by FIPFA for the entire tournament. And so I guess I'll pick him for the player of the tournament. He leads that squad so well. He plays pretty much every position at every point during the game. Fantastic player. And yeah, he's in some of the best form of his career at the moment. So yeah, Chris Gordon is, I guess, the player for West Brom.
Yeah, I mean, he was voted MVP, and there's no doubt he had some excellent moments. I think he is a sensational player. You will struggle to find a bigger fan of him as a player, as a person, anywhere than me. And I truly believe he will be absolutely vital if England are to go deep and ultimately secure the FIPFA Nations Cup. But he wasn't the standout across the week. I think there were several others that should have been voted MVP. One player I really want to spotlight is Lucas Chrysler. It felt like a breakout tournament for him. He handled big minutes, rotated between first and second pivot, and showed real maturity with all those changes in and around West Brom. I think he's going to be really important if they're to have success in 25-26. And like you, so Lucas would be my player, but take nothing away from Chris, who I thought was brilliant in flashes, not necessarily the consistency we see or we've come to expect. And like moment, I would completely agree. Ollie Rock's goal was probably my standout across the competition, and there was some sensational finishes. And beyond that goal, I really just want to give Ollie a shout out, because he understandably in the early stages was a bit tentative, was a bit nervous, and as the week went on, he got better and better. He got more and more minutes, and he ended the tournament as a real star in their squad. So if he can keep that consistency and maintain that confidence, I think he will be a really big player for them going forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. Obviously young, a lot of sort of room and space to learn now. He would have learnt from that tournament. I think he grew into the week as he got more comfortable with playing in front of, the cameras and the big crowd. And it will only do him the world of good. At the end of the day, I don't think West Brom did go to the tournament thinking that they were going to win. I think they went to the tournament knowing that it was going to be difficult, obviously, without Dylan Kelsall, who has now left the club. I think they knew that it was going to be challenging. But the development of players like Lucas Chrysler, like Ollie Rock, will be a massive positive to take from the week for Chris Gordon.
Absolutely. Let's progress on to Aspire now. For me and many others, I think it's fairly universally accepted that they played the best football of the tournament. But it really did come down to a couple of sliding doors moments. John Bolden's controversial red card against Tigres and that disallowed goal versus Grafto Vilnius Dask. If either of those goes the other way, I honestly think we'd be talking about Aspire as world champions. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Obviously, everybody knows that I have, a brother who I love very much, who plays for Aspire, and it was a tough watch, moments of that week. The sliding doors moments you mentioned, sometimes that happens in competition football, and Aspire won the FIPFA Champions Cup the year before, and there were moments in that game where, especially in the final, where, Upsilon missed open goals, and John Bolding maybe tapped Momo Gulami with a bit too much ferocity in the penalty area and stuff like that, which goes your way. And sometimes I think it was very obvious early in the week for Aspire that it was just not going to go their way. They didn't have the rub of the green in terms of the luck. I think they played fantastic football. Some of the goals they scored, especially when the shackles went off, I think we commented on it a lot on commentary. They sort of had those two games, Tigres and then Vilnius, and they were very frustrated. And then they came out against Rayados, and I've never seen a team look more focused and more angry and just so locked in. Their faces, they were just scoring goals. They didn't even look to care. They would just turn around and go again. it was a real statement from Aspire. And then their performance, they beat Club Nacional very convincingly. They beat Western Sydney Wanderers very convincingly. It is very difficult for Aspire to be anything other than proud of what they achieved that week, in the face of some very difficult circumstances. And, they came back and then claimed the domestic cup as well, which was a nice way for them to sort of end the season after what would have been a very frustrating week. And I think the thing that stood out about Aspire this week, that week, and the thing that a lot of people commented on was not actually on the court, but it was the off-the-court unity that the squad had. So many people commented. So there were obviously, there was big tables where you'd go to have dinner, and not many of the clubs, because of the travel thing, stayed around and all ate together. Aspire every evening had to get extra tables, extra chairs to fit the entire sort of squad and extended carers and family on. They all ate together. They were, even after the most difficult games, laughing and smiling. And that was, I think, the big show from Aspire, as it showed the community that they had. And yeah, it was a tough watch at times, because of what happened to them. And, especially the Villeneuve game was just absolutely heartbreaking. But they come out of the week with their heads held high.
Yeah. Firstly, on that Tigres game, or more importantly, that red card, I do think it was soft. I'm not convinced there was much, if any, contact between John and Valentino. But truthfully, if it hadn't been that moment, I think it would have been another. The game had completely boiled over. The emotions were high and the cards were always going to come out. And the number of yellow cards felt justified. But that red card did feel harsh. But I don't read a great deal into that. You touched on it on the start in terms of the format and the 8 clubs and how there's so much jeopardy in each and every group game. And we saw that play out in that fixture against Tigres. It was almost an unfortunate draw for them to start, because they were on the back foot from the moment that full-time whistle went. So, yeah, really unfortunate. We will talk about officiating following our club-by-club breakdown. But that disallowed goal that would have seen Aspire double their lead against Grafto Villeneuve d'Ascq is one of the decisions I'm really struggling to process, because that for me was the sliding doors moment. They win that, they put themselves right back into contention to qualify for the semi-finals, and I think the adversity and the challenges that they experienced through John's red card, having him suspended for that Grafto Villeneuve d'Ascq game, would have just gelled them together, and they would have been formidable, as they were from that point onwards. Yeah. I thought Dan McLellan was outstanding, not just in that game in John's absence, but the whole competition. I just think he is the future of the sport in this country. And the sky is the limit, because what he showed in terms of his maturity, his technical ability, his tactical awareness, he processes it better than anyone that I know at his age. And you can attest more than most, being his brother and spending so much time with him. But he's just obsessed with getting better. So for me, Dan is the player, but my moment for Aspire is more overarching. It's not necessarily one single moment, although I will talk about one. It's the arc of John Dixon. What a journey he's been on. Since joining Aspire, he has been a revelation. And I really hope his story shows players what's possible when you have the right mindset and the right support system around you. The whole squad, as you've already mentioned, is so cohesive and selfless, and I think a lot of that comes from John Baldwin. But it's so nice to spend time with Aspire, so you naturally are supporting and wanting them to win. And on my very last point, John, club and country captain, I'll keep saying this, he is long due a King's Honour. because he is one of the most incredible people I've ever met.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment. I think, you're right to pinpoint John Dixon. He has been probably, in terms of players having a breakout season, one of the top in England. I think it probably goes under the radar a bit. And I think the fact that Aspire didn't have the season they would have wanted in the league doesn't help that. But I think if Aspire had won the league, for example, and John Dixon had the season he did, he would be the player that everybody would be talking about as the next big thing, because he came from Throssell's, where he was playing in a very pragmatic central position, and he has just taken playing that passing football completely under his wing. He's a fantastic finisher. He honestly has one of the most powerful and accurate side hits I've ever seen on any player. He is unbelievably good. And yeah, John Boulding, I think his character was most exemplified after the red card, when he was on the sideline for the Villeneuve game, and that just showed how much Aspire meant to him, because he was sat down there, he was trying to coach from the opposition side, he was trying to get information on, he was trying to support his team, and he kicked every ball of that game. I think you could see him down there going back and forth, the nerves on display. He was so emotionally invested, and has been so emotionally invested in Aspire and the sport as a whole for a long time. And I think if there is anybody in the sport who deserves to be given massive recognition, and as you mentioned, a King's Honour, there is nobody that should be ahead of John Boulding in that queue.
No, I did quickly say that I was going to mention a particular moment from John Dixon, and it's his goal versus Western Sydney Wanderers. It was the John Boulding set piece on the halfway line, played into Dan McLellan, who stayed in reverse, angled his chair, so just cushioned it into the path of his 180 diagonal pass over to John Dixon, who was unopposed on the far post, who just slotted away. They carved Western Sydney Wanderers open, and it just epitomises the relationship and the chemistry those three players have. Not to discredit or discount any of the other or wider Aspire team, but in those three attacking players, they will trouble anyone on their day, and that goal shows why. So yeah, congratulations to Aspire. They obviously travelled back to England and secured the FA Disability Cup final, which is probably no less than they deserved after the almost injustices of Paris. But it's exciting times ahead, and I'm excited to see what they can do in the season ahead. In sixth place, we have Club Nacional de Football of Uruguay. Charlie, we loved watching Uruguay at the World Cup, and watching Club Nacional in Paris gave us, I think, that same feeling, not just because of the player overlap, but because of the intensity, the passion, and the unpredictability they brought. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, they were another team that was so much fun to watch. You mentioned the unpredictability. Genuinely, some of the pieces of skill, especially from Francisco Wilde and Marco Diaz, were so good. Marco Diaz's goal against West Bromwich Albion, sorry, I'll probably steal the moment of the tournament already, but oh my word, that was a ridiculous finish. You can never read. When you watch most of the top teams and the top players, and they score goals because you know what they're going to do, and you can see a million miles off what they're going to do, but it's just so good and so accurate and so powerful that there's nothing you can do to stop it. But that's not what Club Nacional do. You just have no idea what they're going to do. It's so organised, but yet so erratic. It's fantastic to watch. And obviously Lucia Barbosa, who sort of made up that outfield three. She was probably less expressive and less creative, but she was such a steady hand, and she was always there in the right position, defensively in particular. And then obviously they had the wild card edition of Tony Jackson, which was fun. It was great to see Tony out in Paris. He played in goal for a lot of the tournament. It was great. They were a fantastic watch. They deserved to come sixth. They were, a really good team, really enjoyable. They were really unlucky in their opening group game. They could have qualified. They were really unlucky not to get a point out of West Bromwich Albion in their opening group game. They conceded quite scrappy late goal when they were actually very good in that game. And then, again, they just had that really frustrating 0-0 draw with Western Sydney Wanderers, which they should have done better in, really. That was probably their most disappointing moment of the tournament. But if they'd got, that win and the West Bromwich Albion point, who knows what would have happened. But yeah, it was a great watch. Club Nacional's journey over the week, and Uruguay again are going to be in a pretty strong position for the World Cup.
Yeah, obviously they've got to qualify first, which is coming up at the America's Cup in Arizona. But yeah, I hope they're present. Francisco Wilde, a menace, aggressive, energetic, just a horrible player to play against, and I mean that in the best possible way. He gave everything and never gave the opposition a moment's peace. You've touched on it, but I'll reiterate, Marco Diaz, incredible. He's so unconventional in his movement and finishing. You often see him turn his chair the opposite way to how you'd expect a shot to be taken, and early on, that goal against West Brom most notably, the teams just didn't know how to deal with it or cope. I did start to think, and I did say it on commentary at one point, he might become predictable, because whilst it's unconventional, whilst it's world class in its nature, it is readable if the opposition know what to expect. And as soon as I would say that, he would engage it in a completely kind of traditional manner, so to speak, and ensure that danger remained present. And the unpredictability, whether it was unconventional or traditional, proved a nightmare for defenders. The moment for me was the goal against West Brom, and my player, as I think you alluded to, was Lucia Barbosa. Solid, reliable, totally committed, and was such a solid presence throughout the whole tournament. She never switched off, but often went under the radar because the headlines would often lie with Marco Diaz and Francisco Wilde. So I hope they qualify for Argentina, because the short distance between Montevideo and Buenos Aires will mean that they won't be suffering from anything like jet lag or long travel times. It's very convenient, almost as convenient as hosting a home tournament for them due to that distance. So we could come and see them be a real force should they qualify.
Yeah, they will be a side that are going to be very difficult to play against. They were tough to play against at the last World Cup, and they've developed tactically since then, I'm sure. They are a fantastic watch. They are a team that I would hate to, have to coach against, because it's so unpredictable, and being unpredictably predictable as well, which is a bit of a contradiction. But they do very weird things, and then all of a sudden they just do a textbook play out of every team's playbook, and it's like they're so versatile, so adaptable within games, and that's been their great strength. And I hope that carries through. Obviously, Francisco Wilde, Marco Diaz, Lucia Barbosa, you'd expect them to be at least selected for the Uruguay squad, and I hope that the creativity that they showed with Club Nacional is something that they're able to express for the national team as well.
I agree completely. So in 7th we had Western Sydney Wanderers. It was a challenging start for the Australians, particularly in the absence of Zach Dickey, who arrived late due to travelling from the USA due to their club championships, and that definitely affected their ability to find fluency early on, I would say. And their recent struggles in their domestic club championship meant that they didn't come in with the strongest momentum, but they growed steadily across the week. Give me your assessments.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment. I think the introduction of Zach Dickey definitely did give them something more. I think I had a very lengthy conversation with the coach of Western Sydney Wanderers. They were staying in the same hotel as me, so we spent a lot of time with them. They're a great bunch of people, first of all. Players, coaches, carers. They are a fantastic unit. So they just so light-hearted at every moment. They were a pleasure to spend time with. But speaking to their coach, I spoke to him about, maybe the concept of, I think playing with their wingers in reverse would help them a lot. I think it was all a bit too forward-facing. I think that was probably their biggest issue. If they can play with those wingers in reverse and they can be a bit more dynamic on the counter-attack, and also if they can... I mentioned that a lot of teams, to be good, you don't necessarily have to be good at everything. You can have a couple of niches that you're very good at and then just be solid at everything else. So if they can create a really strong defensive platform, which is something that I guess grew throughout the week, they definitely got better defensively as the week went on. And then they can sort of get a niche, whether that be they become very good at set pieces and they have an extensive arsenal of set pieces that they can use, or they become very good at counter-attacking football. If they can really train up one part of their game going forward, they will score a lot more goals and they'll concede a lot less. That's what I'd like to see them do. In terms of the tournament in Paris, they definitely grew into it. It was great that they got the sort of win in the final game. A Ben Keats hat-trick, which was good for him. Obviously, he's coming over to play in England next season. Zach Dickey was fantastic to watch, as usual. Fantastic character on the court. So energetic. That was great. He was a real valuable addition to the tournament, and fair play to him for the absolute hard yards he did in terms of getting over from the Nationals, playing for Western Sydney Wanderers with crazy what must have been jet lag. Fantastic stuff. It was a good watch from their perspective. I think they will have enjoyed and learnt a lot from the week, and it'll be good to see them at future tournaments, hopefully.
Yeah, I agree completely with all of those points. I think they brought heart into all of their games, and that 7th place showdown with Raidos was their most complete showing. They hadn't scored a goal up until that point. Ben Keat was brilliant, netting a hat-trick with some beautifully angled finishing, really cute movement and angling of his chair, which just snuck it through the defence. I echo what you're saying about playing in reverse or finding their niche, because it doesn't look as if they've got that yet, but they have the foundations to really build upon now. If Ben Keat is coming over to play with GBG Knights in the Premiership, he will have to work on that playing in reverse, because in England it's so important to the way teams set up, certainly GBG Knights. Zach Dickey, as you've said, clearly the most high-profile player in their squad, and his class was evident, but the player I want to spotlight is Andy Waite. I think he played in every position across their games in the week, and looked solid in every single one of them, and that versatility proved a real asset for Western Sydney Wanderers. So my player would be Andy Waite. My moment would be the opener in that 7th place showdown, Ben Keat just sneaking it in past the Raidos defence. But a good week for Western Sydney Wanderers. Now, from a more Australian perspective, is focusing on that OPO championships. I'm not sure if any of the Western Sydney Wanderers are present. I don't think they are, but they'll be most definitely supporting the Poweroos as they look to book their spot for Buenos Aires. We come on to our final team of the 8, Raidos Powerchair. They didn't win a game, but they won over plenty of fans. I think this was a real milestone in their development, their first exposure to a competition of this scale. And whilst they leave without a win, I think they gained invaluable experience that will serve them so well moving forward. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, I think they were really... They're another team that grew into the week. You could tell that they were really enjoying the challenge. Obviously, they had a couple of harsh moments. They had, I think, 2 red cards going off the pitch, which is something that I don't like to see. It's another tough one. It's another law that I feel should be reviewed, maybe. very harsh from the officials to sort of not just turn a little blind eye, considering the moments of the game that it was in as well. But they really grew into the week. I think obviously the highlight of it for them was their goal against Aspire, Roberto Camero. Fantastic goal. But yeah, I think that was the highlight. They grew into it. They were a team that became more defensively solid. I don't think they ever really got their attacking football going. But obviously Mexico is a place where the sport is really in its early stages of its sort of development and spreading over there. It's definitely ramping up, it seems, from the conversations that are being had. Obviously the Mexican national team becoming more and more prominent as well. I hope that, in future, if we do have a Mexican team at these tournaments, they will have, improved, and they will have learnt from the footage that they now have available to them of playing against the top teams and seeing what they do and analysing that. But yeah, I thought it was a great week for Rayados. I'm sure they would have learnt a lot, and they seemed very, very pleased to be there and be involved, which is always good.
No, I completely agree. I echo that. The goal against Aspire, the clear highlight. Roberto Camero was so persistent throughout the whole game, proved a real nuisance. And I'm so happy that they can go away with that historic moment. If they continue progressing at the rate we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, which I think is as long as they've been around, they could be real contenders come 2029, depending on how the qualification process looks. But no, overall they bring fantastic support, and I think they loved their experience. So good on them. So that summarises the 8 teams. We're going to go on to a fun, interactive, quick-fire question round in just a little bit. But before we do, because I think we'll be told off if we don't, I want to talk about the refereeing standards and consistency. Because while the football rightly takes centre stage, how a tournament is officiated can play a huge role in the overall experience for players, for coaches and spectators. This was a landmark for Powerchair football. And naturally, with any first-time events, there are always going to be learnings and things to build on. I think, Charlie, it's fair to say that there was inconsistency in how the laws were interpreted by the match officials, especially between groups, with different referees seeming to apply slightly different interpretations depending on their background or region, which naturally led to some frustrations, particularly I think around the contact decisions, the advantage ruling. And whilst it's in the laws of the game, it's clear cut, you've spoken about it, the rule which is fairly universally unpopular, the red card offence when a defensive player leaves the court to prevent a clear goal scoring opportunity. So whilst there was inconsistencies, I do feel there was real improvement as the tournament progressed. The officiating started to settle, and we saw much more consistency across the board, no matter who was in the centre. And maybe it just took time to adjust and align. How did you feel the overall standard of officiating was across the week? And do you think there's a wider conversation to be had about developing that global consistency, which is challenging when we only get a handful of international tournaments like this every year?
Yeah, it's tough. I want to preface this by saying that anything that I say is not an attack on any match official individually. I think that the issue, because I did feel that there was a significant issue with the way that the games were being officiated, but I don't think that was with officials themselves. I think that was probably my gripes were with sort of the instructions and direction they were given. I think there were some significant individual errors. I think the advantage, the Villeneuve Aspire game is really tough to swallow. And I think it came off the back of a controversial refereeing performance in the morning as well, which didn't help. I think it was a mistake, an honest error. I think, referees, just like players, make mistakes sometimes. and it's a thankless task being a referee. That said, there are a couple of things that I found really frustrating. I think the threshold of contact that was picked for this tournament was not conducive to showcasing the sport at its best. I think if I was being 100% honest, a random person who turned on their TV in France and I turned it on and I watched one of the early games in the competition, I would not have enjoyed the sport. I think I found it incredibly frustrating as someone who is a massive fan of the sport, watching games with some of the best players in the world being stopped every 30 seconds for the tiniest of touches, yellow cards flying around, which meant players couldn't tackle the way that they wanted to, battles between players like Valentino and John Boulding. That's an interesting one, because that should be one of the most physical, one of the most exciting battles between two individual players in the sport, because they are two of the leading central players. They are two very, they're robust central players, and they weren't even allowed to touch each other. They were completely sort of stopped from tackling in the way that they wanted to. There were a couple of really sort of almost comical moments, particularly between Zach Dickey and John Boulding, where a foul was given and they both sort of looked at each other and they're like, did I foul you? No. Did you foul me? No. And the referee stood there, with a yellow card in their hand. It was a tough watch. I think the contact rule needs to be standardised. I personally feel that we've got it pretty nailed on here in England. I am very happy with the level of officiating in the National League. I think, of course, there are mistakes made, but generally, going to these European tournaments has shown me that the level of officials in the National League is very, very good here in England. And I think the fact that obviously Steve Crump, one of our officials, ended up doing the final and a semi-final and gaining massive sort of compliments for his officiating performances within those games is a massive plus for Jeff Lewis, the head of referees, who will be very pleased with that. But I think there needs to be a standardisation of the rules. I don't like this 3 strikes and you're out contact thing. I think you should not be allowed, I think, to make a new rule, and it feels like that is almost adding a rule to the game, that you're only allowed 3 contact fouls before a yellow card. It also then raises a weird grey area where surely some contact fouls worse than others, yet they seem to be treated with the equal punishment. A player could tap another player 3 times illegally, and then a player could smash hit another player 3 times, and it felt like the same punishment was being awarded for that. It was frustrating. It was really difficult. I think watching players have to sort of, as I mentioned with Valentino Zegarelli earlier, sort of reclusing games because they didn't want to be penalised was difficult. And I don't think, as I said, the threshold of contact was conducive to the best football being played. And I'd say that in future tournaments, players should be consulted more before the tournament about the level of contact they feel is appropriate, what they feel is dangerous, what's not, because at the end of the day, I think the players do know better than anyone what is acceptable and what's not.
Yeah, I think once you get that standardisation, then it will let the football shine. And the point you raised about either Zach and John or John and Valentino is most of the times no one is complaining or appealing for contact fouls, yet they're given anyway. And that 3-strike system only came in the latter stages of the competition, so it's obviously something that was implemented or discussed at the midway point. So yeah, I completely agree with a lot of what you said. But I do want to take this moment to really credit a few referees in particular who, for me, set the standard. And this isn't to downplay the efforts of others. Every official played their part in delivering this event. But 3 names stood out for me in terms of the professionalism, the consistency, and just the way they carried themselves. That being Steve Crump, Mark Simon Green, and Nico Ballin. And what impressed me was their willingness to communicate, not just during the games, but around them as well. There was moments where Nico, for example, openly acknowledged where he'd made a mistake, particularly in around applying that advantage ruling. And that kind of honesty goes such a long way. You could see the teams accepting it immediately because he owned it, he humanised it, and that completely quashed the matter. And that isn't always easy to do under pressure for a referee. So he deserves credit for that. I think we said it on commentary. If I haven't, I want to reiterate it now. Before the final, Steve Crump was out on the court a good half hour, 40 minutes or so before kickoff. I think you and I, Charlie, were the only other ones in the hall locking in ahead of the final, aligning our commentary notes. But he was on his own, on the court, warming up, stretching, mentally preparing like a player would, like a professional would. And that level of detail genuinely amazed me. And it's something others in the sport, not just referees, could learn a lot from. And then lastly, Mark Simon Green, probably my favourite official across the week. I think compared to the other two, he has not nearly any experience, but he was brilliant. And I think it might be a cultural thing with Aussie officials, but his communication was superb. Calm, it was clear, it was consistent, and every decision he made had clarity and purpose. And I know the players appreciated that. You'll know this, Charlie, and if our listeners haven't seen it, it reminded me a lot of when Jared Gillett was mic'd up for his final A-League game before moving to the Premier League. You got this insight into how top-level officiating is, about presence, about connection, not just the rules. And we saw that with Mark Simon Green in Paris, and funnily enough in Sydney as well in 2023, because other officials, David Weeb, Ellie Smithers and Rebecca Gullet, all brought that same energy and clarity. So yeah, just like the players, I think for officials there is an adjustment, and getting up to the pace of an international game is something that is challenging, and it's something that should be a focus for them ahead of a huge couple of months. So yeah, in summary, a lot of early frustrations, but the consistency started to come as the tournament progressed, ultimately allowing the football to shine. And I think we said it, Charlie, if we're not talking about a referee, or we make no remarks about a referee, they've probably done a good job.
Yeah, you don't notice them when they're good, and I think it's a really awkward one to talk about, because referees, obviously, it's a lot easier in the Premier League as well when they're on crazy money and they make huge errors and they're training for a game all week. But you know, the referees at the Club World Cup were at the end of the day volunteers. I know they had expenses paid, but they were volunteers. They are doing it for the sort of love of the sport and the love of the game, and it's really difficult to be too critical of them. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, if we want to be an elite sport, then we need elite level officiating and elite level consistency. And that's not us by any means saying that referees can't make mistakes, because they will, and they do in any sport at any level. But the accountability need to be shown. And also, I hope that one of the things that comes from this tournament is referees being a bit more analytical of their own performances. I'd love to see referees that watch footage back, and I'd love, at these tournaments, there's no excuse really for there not to be a referees meeting every evening where they watch just a couple of clips of film and they watch it back and they discuss it and they discuss how they're going to implement things differently, and did we feel that we did the best in this moment as a team, as a unit, potentially having recordings of their communication in their ears that they can listen back to and go, did we communicate as concisely and as effectively as we did? And I think all of those things will just help to make the sport more elite, and the referees are a big part of that, and they deserve a lot of credit for what they do on a weekly basis in their own countries and in the national leagues. But also when they come to these big tournaments, it's really important that they perform at the highest standard. And also it's really important that, because I think the issue is also that there has to be the right instructions given to the referees, and it's really important that enough forethought is put into instructing referees and making sure the referees know what they need to do in every eventuality. And I don't think that was necessarily properly dealt with for this tournament. I hope it's something that FIPFA will go back and look at before the next.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be, because they will want to develop and ensure that the officiating isn't the thing that leaves or makes the headlines. But just that simple consultation with the players or the teams or the coaches, I think, could be a really powerful body of work that just sets expectation and allows players to have a little bit of contribution when it comes to the standardisation of the rules. Okay, so that pretty much summarises it all. So I think we'll just end on a quick fire round where you can pick or tell me your standout performers, memorable moments, etc. So let's start with a big one. Just quick one. Tell me the name and a quick bullet point to go along with it. Player of the tournament.
Brian Weiss. I thought Villeneuve were the best team, and I thought he was the standout player. Even though he didn't start the competition the best, his performance in the semi-final and the final was two of the best individual performances I've seen. He deserved to be in a winning team, and he was absolutely unbelievable.
Okay, mine will be Slim Bouchetta. I thought he was sensational. I completely disregard the mistake in the final, because up until then he had been faultless. His distribution, his commanding at the back, his chemistry with Brian Weiss should have justified a World Cup title. Young player.
I've gone for... There weren't actually a huge amount of young players in the tournament. I've gone for Dan McLellan for Aspire. I think he was really mature in the Villeneuve game and contributed to a lot of goals. He's my young player.
Yeah, completely agree with that. Absolute standout. I actually had him as my player of the tournament. So on my sheet here, I've got Slim Bouchetta and Dan McLellan, but I'll probably be told off if I pick two. So that just shows the level in which he was performing at, that irrelevant of age. He's in the considerations for the top accolades, not just the young player. Coach of the tournament.
Yeah, it's a good one. I think this is going to be a bit of an unpopular choice maybe, but I actually think Chris Gordon, considering the players that he had around him and the young squad and the way that he rallied them to put on performances when they were down in games. You know, when they were 3-0 down, he managed to get some of the best football out of his team. When they were 1-0 down in the third, fourth place playoff, he managed to get great football out of his team. I think he did a very good job of managing the young players and their characters, and he held together a really sort of quite an experienced squad. So yeah, Chris Gordon, he is a fantastic coach, isn't he? And he I think was my coach of the tournament.
No, great pick. I've picked Ignacio Aguilera and Facundo Cala, who are the coaches of Tigres de Pacheco. I thought they were so good, so entertaining, and the way they set up on set pieces is so unique that clearly comes from the training court and what they work on away from these competitive games. So yeah, they are my pick. Best individual performance in a single match.
I went for Brian Weiss versus West Bromwich Albion in the semi-final. I thought his performance was absolutely top level. He just ran the show. His passing was ridiculous. He didn't lose a battle. It was Brian Weiss at his very, very best. Yeah, that was my best individual performance.
I've picked Dan McLellan versus Grafto Villeneuve Dask. Even if you strip away all of the context and just watch the game, Dan McLellan completely nullified Brian Weiss, which is an almost impossible task. You layer in the detail that was adapting to the suspension of John Balding. Dan McLellan playing in an almost unfamiliar position than what we're used to. He just rose to the level needed and was sensational. He deserved the win from that game. Aspire deserved 3 points. Sadly, it didn't go that way, but in terms of an individual performance, one of the best I've ever seen from a player ever. Goal of the tournament.
I've gone for Ollie Rock versus Villeneuve. What an absolute screamer. it was really well worked, and the finish is just perfect. And I think to find that in a game where they were really down and out, West Brom, to find that and give them just that tiny glimmer of hope was fantastic from Ollie.
Yeah, I have picked the exact same goal. Hard to look past Momo's in the final. Yes, you can probably say it's more a Slim Bouchetta mistake, but just to produce that in the final seconds of the final game was unbelievable. But I agree. Ollie Rock's goal was just amazing. Give me your breakout star, someone who really surprised you, who you wasn't necessarily expecting to do so.
Florian Lechantre is mine. I think he's obviously a player with a lot of calibre, but he's not a player that I was particularly familiar with before the tournament, and he was one of the best performers at the tournament. He was so good. I'm really disappointed for him that he didn't get a chance to feature in the final and the semi-finals as much, because I really would have liked to see him involved in those and scoring the goals that he scored earlier in the tournament. But he was my breakout star. He was fantastic to watch.
Yeah, I've got two honourable mentions for mine. I've got Yusuf Ayadzadam, who was just brilliant. Such a silky smooth attacking player. Noel Zaren is my other honourable mention, just due to that unique distribution and the power that he generates. But my breakout star was John Dixon, for all of the points raised when we discussed Aspire. Just the whole story, kind of the arc of his Powerchair football career, how he was just a squad player in and amongst West Bromwich Albion Throstles, and he's moved to Aspire, completely revitalised his football, and is now one of the first names on the team sheet. And some of the performances and goals in Paris mean he is my breakout. Give me your dream team, your 4 players.
I've gone for Chris Gordon in goal, Brian Weiss next to him in the middle, Youssef Ayadzadam on one wing, and Dan McLellan on the other.
Yeah, very nice. I've gone with Slim Bouchetta in goal. I've got Dan McLellan in the centre, maybe controversially. And I've got wingers of Heber Lopez and Tristan Delmas. So nice, we've got a little bit of variation. But no, that concludes it. That brings us to the end of our deep dive into the 2025 FIPFA Powerchair Football Club World Cup. A week we will certainly never forget. Calling all of the action from the PRISME was one of my favourite competitions that I've ever had the pleasure of attending. And I'm sure you would agree, Charlie. Thank you for joining me today and sharing every second of that journey with me. And thanks as always to MK Battery for powering the podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this across social media. We've got a lot of exciting episodes in the pipeline, so hopefully we can increase the quantity of these episodes in the off season and maintain them when the football kickstarts again. Next up would be the Nations Cup in Italy, so a lot of excitement as the months roll on. We'll be back very soon. Until then, take care. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.